Hello, everybody. I hope that everybody is hear us right now. We're happy to see you all today here at our panel discussion about cloud versus on-premise. We're at Acure planning these events weekly, and you can join us, stay up to date, following us on social media and registering our events. And just a couple of words about Acure as organizer of this event. It is a cloud-based AIOps solution for the best observability, incident control, and event management. We're about to release our new version of the platform soon, so you can try it completely for free and tell us, do you like it or not? Because we're all about to hear your feedback. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments section right here on YouTube about platform and questions to our speakers. And I'm really excited to introduce our panelists. It's Marius Zaharia, Cloud Solution Architect and Principal Engineer at Société Générale, Adam Arakelian, Senior Director of Engineering at Dell AMC, and Richard Simon, CTO, Cloud Transformation at T-Systems International. Each speaker has a huge experience and an impressive background, and each of them is about to tell us about their approaches and their side they choose, like cloud versus on-premise versus hybrid. So we'll hear a lot of great stuff today. And just a quick notice on our agenda, so everybody will be on one page. We'll start with 5-minute speeches from each speaker, and after that we'll dive into discussion, and we'll bring your question, which you wrote in our comment section, also to the discussion. So please don't hesitate and share your thoughts, your questions, everything you want in the comment section, and we can start. Okay, I would unmute our speakers, and let's start with Adam.
Sure.
Please tell us about. Great, thank you. And you?
Good, thanks. Good, thanks. So, so when we think about cloud infrastructure and on-prem infrastructure, you know, in all honesty, it really depends on the use cases that we're trying to fulfill, right? Depending on which way to go, and there's no silver bullet per se, right? Whether you're jumping on an on-premise solution or a cloud infrastructure solution. I will say what we're beginning to see more and more of from working in Dell, we're beginning to see more and more of is where's your data, and the ability to obtain that information easily, and how you can manage that data in a easy, secure, reliable way. And so, like I said before, it depends on the set of use cases that you're trying to fulfill. But one thing that we've seen that's extremely prevalent in the industry today is the whole notion of multi-cloud. So a combination of both on-prem and off-prem, both infrastructure and data accessibility. And so when we begin to think about that, and if we realize that data is a key asset to organizations, the whole notion of multi-cloud begins to make a ton of sense, not just from an infrastructure perspective or from an application perspective, but from a data perspective.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, I think we can go around with each opinion, and after that we'll dive into discussion, as I said. And maybe Richard, you can add something from your side.
Sure, yes. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to, I just want to say welcome to all our audience. Yeah, it's a pleasure for me to be able to participate in this panel discussion on cloud versus on-prem. So as Kate said, I'm CTO for cloud transformation at T-Systems. T-Systems is the IT service arm of Deutsche Telekom. As you probably well know, Deutsche Telekom is the telco giant in Germany. So for me, I guess I'm kind of more in the cloud space, and that's kind of my really sort of specialization and forte. So I'll probably kind of defend cloud a little bit more in our discussion for today. And obviously, there's a number of reasons why you'd want to go to cloud. Just I usually kind of tend to start with some so-called scary stats, as I call them. So again, looking at the UK sort of market for cloud, the UK government spent I think 2.8 billion pounds on public cloud over the last year, I believe, these figures are from, I believe, from Gartner, and also in 2022, global spend was around $494 billion. So if you kind of put that into perspective, and that's growing into next year, the prediction is that will grow to around $600 billion next year. So if you kind of put that into perspective, that's all of the revenue from all the sort of data center vendors put together and more kind of combined into that figure. I mean, clouds, I do agree with Adam to an extent that cloud is not the kind of answer for everything, and there are certain types of workloads that either require specialization in their hardware or they are just kind of really there to be sweated as assets, and then kind of the customer can, the organization can move off of those particular platforms. So I think there is, yes, a case for sort of doing various things in the data center, or having like a hybrid solution. Again, my definition of multi-cloud is different from Adam's. Multi-cloud for me is multiple public clouds and not a hybrid cloud solution. Because if you're kind of doing data center and public cloud, I would call that a hybrid cloud solution. But point being is that, yes, there are kind of those types of workloads that do require that. Having said that, of course, we're seeing a lot more movement of those kind of specialized workloads into the cloud. We're seeing a lot more use of SAP, for example. That's kind of been a very staunch kind of platform for the data center, and we're seeing kind of all the public cloud providers embracing that. We're seeing a lot more of the kind of the heavy intensive sort of compute and calculation, so things like the sort of the ARM based sort of processor technology is being introduced, and actually the likes of Amazon Web Services actually make their own processor for that, so they actually can offer those types of workloads and that type of infrastructure for customers who want to do things like high performance computing, HPC, and very kind of specialized type of stuff. So it's not there. I think it's kind of all that stuff is going to go in that direction. It's certainly not there. And yes, there are different potentially cases there. Why cloud for me, kind of generally very quickly, it's the shift really from sort of a CapEx sort of model, a capital expenditure model, to an operating expenditure model, to an OpEx model. And that kind of really frees up organizations to be able to focus on things like innovation, to being able to spin up services much more quickly, to be able to compete in their markets, and also the ability to fail fast. The data center and that kind of world is very much focused on resilience and high availability, and failure is not an option, and 5 nines kind of approach, whereas cloud really expects a failure. So you just need to kind of work out how you deal with that failure. And there's obviously multiple ways that you can actually do that, not just kind of different availability zones, but actually hardening your software, for example, using things like chaos engineering. That's another sort of innovation there. There's a lot of, I think, misunderstanding around security. My sort of take is that there's better security in the cloud, just simply because the public cloud providers are doing the security not just for you as a customer, but they do it for all of their customers, and also it's a very high grade sort of level of security as well. So they obviously deal with and have customers that are government agencies, and those government agencies, no matter who they are, whether US, UK, or kind of worldwide, require certain levels of security that are specific to to kind of their levels, and therefore, as a standard sort of organization that's selling various products or services or whatever, and you want to go into those public clouds, you actually gain from that advantage. You actually gain from the goodness that's actually been done for you in that level of security. the ability to scale is really important. In the data center, it's quite a difficult sort of process to do that. There's a number of different stages that are involved, everything from procurement to delivery to implementation, installation, configuration, testing, production, support, maintenance, upgrades, and patching. And I'm saying that in one breath. In the cloud, it's, you kind of forego all of them, you bypass all of those earlier steps, and you just focus really on the development of your service and actually the provisioning of your service. And obviously there are tools that help you to scale that, and scaling out rather than up in the cloud, and that will help you to obviously be able to increase the demand, or if there is an increased demand, you can actually respond to that increased demand much more quickly than you would be able to do potentially in the data center. And then there's other advantages. I won't go into kind of into all those. I might come in a little bit later on those, but things like time spent more on development and innovation, going into new markets, new geographies for your organization. You can spin up your same services that have been kind of very successful and trusted in your existing geography, and if you're kind of expanding your business in another geography, you can do that very, very quickly. There's infrastructure tools that help you to build a new environment for a new geography with specific changes, very, very quickly in a matter of minutes if necessary. And I say I think probably the final thing for now I'd say is that the focus is on software. It's not on sort of hardware and resilience and things like that. So it's all about really having applications that are composable and orchestrated services.
Thank you very much for such detailed answer. Actually, I think you cover some topics we would like to discuss a bit later, but we will be get back to that topic as well. Thank you very much. And okay, let's go to our first speaker, Marius. Please tell us more about your experience, your thoughts about this topic.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Kate, for inviting me in this awesome panel with Adam and Richard. And very interested to speak on these topics. Once again, I'm from Société Générale as Cloud Solution Architect, working in infrastructure solutions to be implemented for different business units within the company being a large one, a global one, with multiple very heterogeneous units. I'm also Microsoft MVP and Azure MVP, speaking of the cloud, but working lately also on AWS and also with the private cloud. So we're in the hybrid world like this. Maybe just a small detail is that I won't formally represent today my company Société Générale. I'm not entitled to do that today, but I'm expressing my position as cloud solution architect with some experience in the field, I would say. So yeah, I believe my colleagues here mentioned a lot of interesting topics and exactly the key things that we are trying to address and trying to position when we speak about where to put your application. And these different criterias let you switch between on-prem and the cloud. But I maybe just want to go a bit further on that and speak about this notion of multi-cloud as you guys spoke about it. For me, we speak about multi-cloud as with at least, maybe this is the good number of 2 cloud solution providers from the public space and a private cloud also opportunistically being present in the company or in the companies for application perimeters that cannot go in some situations in the public cloud. And this is for me the multi-cloud, at least these 3 pieces together. And on premises, the rest of the on premises is what is like traditional computing or traditional infrastructure, if you want. And I won't go through all the things like security, compliance, agility, scalability, reliability, application lifecycle, CI/CD. There are many, many things, and then maybe I'll let you, Kate, to decline these things one by one if you intend to do that. I would say that if there are some things to make you decide on which side to put the things, definitely you have to put them on both sides. On the public cloud and on the private cloud, at least for the security and compliance reasons, for some assets that today cannot be on the public cloud, at least from the regulatory perspective. And then there is another important aspect, which is the lock-in, which frightens a lot of people, right? Being too dependent on a particular provider, no matter it's cloud provider or whatever else, is frightening every company, especially when business life depends on it. And this is why it's important to have this interesting choice, not to put all your eggs in the same basket, as you know, but put them, I would say, smartly, in a smart way, like not necessarily forced to use both Azure and AWS in the same application, which could be absurd if it's not required by the application itself. But think of like departments, full departments or business units who will focus their competencies based on their maybe interest and culture on one cloud provider versus the other one, and depending also, as I said, on this kind of sensitive workloads and the lock-in that I spoke about it, some workloads would definitely go on the private cloud on premises in that extent. I don't know if you agree with me, guys.
Okay, thank you very much for your thoughts, because actually you just starting our discussion, because my next questions is actually several questions from my list. So we can start about, for example, how do you choose what way you proceed in your organization? So how can people who would like to understand which way better for the organizations can also proceed with this process of choosing something? Because some people don't understand like pros and cons, and maybe we can like describe how do you get to that point when you understand, okay, multi-cloud is best for decision for us, or like on-premise is best decision, or fully cloud is best decision. So you represent each like different companies, but mostly in enterprise, so like only in enterprises, as I can say, and you can cover like from your side, from your perspective. So if you can add something for those who would like to choose something from different approaches, please do.
I mean, I'll chime in on that one, because I both fundamentally agree with Marius's point regarding compliance and regulatory regulatory drives that might be imposed from your government, right? So in some cases, you may not have a choice depending on what your government is telling you based on what industry you're in, whether it's healthcare or finance, which are heavily government regulated, right? And so, but in many cases, I do also fundamentally agree with what Richard was saying about, say, things like security. So when we think about a cloud business as a general provider, their entire focus is on ensuring security of data, infrastructure, reliability, scalability, all of those nice ilities that we like to talk about, right? And so when you're beginning to think about whether it's on-prem, off-prem, or a little bit of both, it comes back to what are the use cases that is driving your organization, or what constraints do you have that you have to work around. And so, if I'm a general, Joe Blow, so to speak, right, general technology company, well, I may have no bounds. So in that case, I'd much prefer to go to on cloud, or I should say a cloud-based environment. And depending on what I'm trying to accomplish there, it may make a lot of sense. If I'm trying to drive a as a service platform or as a service piece of software, it may make total sense. If I don't have the ability to drive reliability and scalability and all of those abilities internally, especially if I'm a smaller organization, right? I just may not have the capital to do that. If I'm a larger organization, I'm a technology company, and also depending on when I grew up, meaning if I am a 30-year-old organization and I have already made a multi-billion-dollar investment in all of my capital from an infrastructure perspective, do I want to really begin to give that up versus pushing everything out to the cloud? Or do I want to begin to look at the cloud as a scalability option so that I no longer make investments, or I make hybrid investments between my capital expense versus my operational expense? And it comes back to, where are you from an organization growth perspective, and what are you ultimately trying to accomplish, and where are you trying to invest? I mean, I can speak for in multiple organizations that I've been at, both small and large. It all ultimately comes down to where you're trying to drive your organization from a mission and from a business perspective. And you can, believe it or not, it's much less of a technology investment rather than a business investment. It's much more of a business investment. And to be frank, I mean, whether it's cloud-based or not, it kind of doesn't really matter. What matters is what are you trying to do from a business value perspective? And Richard and Marius, what do you guys think about that?
I mean, I think for me, I think this is kind of a very wide sort of subject or question. So it's hard to kind of pin down exactly everything. I'll try and kind of hit on a few points. In terms of kind of, should we go cloud, should we not go cloud? I think that's something that is born out of, the business requirements, I think, as Adam said. And then you kind of make a decision there, and then, IT obviously helps with that process. And IT continues that process with things like a competency center or a cloud center of excellence that kind of drives, the decisions. If it's empowered, it drives the decisions for sort of migrating to cloud, and kind of makes all the sort of major decisions: which partner, which consultancy to work with, how do we do, app migrations, which platforms, which technologies, and so on. And then you kind of maybe look at it from a business perspective and say, yes, what's the business trying to actually achieve here? Well, as we said, kind of compete in the market, innovation, bring products faster to the market, and so on. And that's all kind of, yes, cloud can tick all those boxes. But obviously, yes, there is, other things like compliance, security, regulations, and so on. And where, again, cloud is kind of, ticking a lot of those boxes at the moment. It's able to offer that. And certainly that's why we see, governments kind of, making the move to cloud and spending lots of money with the public cloud providers. There are other, innovations as well. I mean, again, not necessarily kind of focusing on T-Systems, but we have in Germany, for example, we have a so-called sovereign cloud, and that really is a sort of a governance layer on top of the Google Cloud Platform, the GCP platform, and that really guarantees sovereignty of data and communication and packets and everything else, on that on that system. So that basically kind of ticks the boxes for regulation and compliance and things like that. But also we're seeing innovation coming in on that aspect of it, to be included as part of the software that's actually being provisioned in the cloud. So things like technologies such as policy as code, that's kind of part of how you would develop, new applications, cloud native applications, to include the policies that you require within the actual code itself, so that there is that kind of capability. And again, you can achieve the regulatory requirements and the sort of policy requirements, either for your own organization or just the market sector you happen to be in. In terms of how you move forward, there are set kind of steps that you can take. I won't go into all the details now, but you make your decisions based on the applications. You make them certainly on things like the lease on your data center. You certainly make them on things like the licenses that you have for very sort of established or corporate applications, such as Oracle database or SQL Server, or those kind of very hardcore kind of things. And you look at kind of all of those things. You look at subscriptions, you look at licensing. As Adam said, if you just bought a whole bunch of new Dell servers, you'd obviously want to take advantage of those, right? And you want to sweat those assets. But eventually, you would look at, if you are kind of going into cloud, you would look at not really furthering that sort of data center environment, and actually new applications sort of going to cloud, or ending up in some kind of a multi-cloud sort of environment, or even a cross-cloud environment. And we'll maybe come into cross-cloud a little bit later and explain that. But the point being is that there is different kind of approaches to that. There's assessments that we can do, and then we can look at kind of the low-hanging fruits. Now, that's for established enterprises, as Adam, I think, mentioned earlier on. For newer kind of companies or startups, I don't really see them doing anything, in terms of their own assets. They just go straight to cloud. And again, there's a number of those sort of examples where they've kind of jumped into one of the stages, and I kind of define it as 4 stages of going to cloud. But they've kind of jumped into one of those stages immediately and kind of started their business, in the public cloud.
Mm-hmm. Marius, maybe you can add something.
Yeah, pretty much in phase with what you have mentioned. Just to have clearly the perspectives that we are talking about. Of course, the first is the radical decision at the beginning of the story, which is I have a case, business case, as Adam says. Shall I go to the cloud or not? Shall I go to which cloud, which public cloud in that case, which will be my decision? And from that point, from the fact that you have a business case with some timelines and some, time to market expected, with, I don't know, all the other constraints, which start not being anymore only business only. There will non-functional requirements that may come there, and at that moment you'll take a look and see, I believe, as per these requirements, the public cloud will go better than what I have on premises right now. On the contrary, if I do have particular constraints, for example, latency or something, I don't know, maybe workplace devices constraints, which are not possible to be, I don't know, joining cloud infrastructure right away. I know there are solutions today, of course, but not possibly in that context. In that moment, the company will stick or will continue to invest on premises. But this is, once again, I believe, not once in a life decision, because the life means there are several big steps like decades and things like that, but still it's a very important decision ahead. And then choosing between the cloud providers, that's an interesting one, because theoretically we are supposed to say, yeah, every company, not necessarily the small ones, but bigger ones who have the meanings, will make this further assessment analysis very clearly at that stage, which cloud provider has best capabilities in this one and this one. And of course, it does matter in terms with, for example, expecting particular maturity in, let's say, containers and Kubernetes services. Let's say this one. But what's interesting is that I found that often it's rather a matter of development culture in the team than definitive objective choice of comparative assessments between the service cloud providers. And from that point, many things are driven, and what's also interesting from a certain point, we need to be very careful not to simply listen to developers go on, because it will be very difficult to put in place the right environment around their applications in that cloud that they want. So this is the interesting path I'm seeing. And from that moment, we have also decisions between maybe having multiple clouds, as I said before, in a larger company. And there's a decision like a pattern for an application or application type, where to go, because you have the choice, which is a good thing. It costs money, but having that choice may give certain benefits to these applications, because they can choose where to put their workloads in which cloud, depending on, once again, mostly the same criteria. But there's no, let's say, one upfront decision, but it will be much more flexible at the moment of decision for that application.
Marius, it sounds like you need a cloud center of excellence.
We do have that.
Well, they should be making all the decisions on which platforms and what applications to migrate.
That's a good one. And actually, there are some patterns, and there are some procedures defined on that. But I believe there are still interesting signals coming from when you are in a heterogeneous environment, and you all want to be both very procedural, very clear, following all the things like you want, in the same time have some agility available in order for you to be dynamic in the market, and have these some branches which are given more agility for that. So in that extent, you see options to come, and you want to take that into consideration. So the point I've seen in regards to this idea of everything putting in cases, it works for between 50 to 70% of the 75% of the cases, and the rest, you need to leave that agility for the things to happen and to drive the change in your place also.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you for challenging that, Richard.
Yes, thank you. And actually, I have a question. We see, like, when we're talking with some companies, that some companies strictly prohibited, like, some cloud SaaS apps or services. And maybe you can tell from your perspective again, which services you can't move to cloud, for example, or in addition, which products you would not like buy to your organization because it's like cloud SaaS or something. What criteria you can apply for these two cases? So first, which services, like as functions in your companies, you can move to cloud because of like some cons on cloud environment, and like core services. And second is which SaaS providers can be prohibited in your organization as well because of that criteria, and which criteria. Really difficult question, I think. Even 3 questions.
Yeah. To try to answer, to try to answer all three.
Thanks.
it, it I would say from a prohibiting organizations, or I should say organizations that prohibit moving to the cloud, I, I would say at this point are, in my experience, are few and far between, right? Like I was saying earlier, I can imagine compliance and regulatory agencies not liking parts of say certain information being in the cloud, although we have to admit it is ultimately, or has a level of security, and organizations like Amazon are definitely working with compliance and regulatory agencies to make sure that they are meeting those standards, like HIPAA, for example. HIPAA is a standard for healthcare, right, in the United States. And so while AWS does offer a level of HIPAA compliance, there are still many hospitals and even insurance agencies which would prefer to keep all of their data and information on-prem. While they may have some off-prem levels of information that are in the cloud, there are still restrictions there. When we think about things like education, and we think about in the education field, I work for Boston University part-time as a part-time faculty member there. I teach a lot of online classes. All of those platforms are hosted in AWS. Now, you could argue that there is some pertinent information that's out there that might impose a security risk or issue. However, from an educational perspective, there is a general sense that hosting something like that in AWS is perfectly legitimate. So, I would say at this point, in my experience, there hasn't been necessarily any definitive restriction on, hey, you can't use cloud infrastructure at all. I would say the restrictions that I've seen is, well, you can only host so much in the cloud versus on-prem. And again, taking us back to that sort of hybrid model. But we all have to recognize that one of the things that drives many organizations today is data and the criticality of data and information. And what I think organizations are finding in general is that once that data is put into a public cloud provider, pulling that data out and trying to say switch providers is incredibly difficult. Not impossible, but incredibly challenging. And so, to what Marius had said earlier, by keeping your options open and not being locked down, I think is an incredibly critical point, because the reality is things will shift and change over time. Cloud providers will hold competitive advantage. Others will fall into competitive necessity, and you want to have those options. So depending on what level of investment you're willing to make in a cloud provider and the amount of data that you're willing to put into a public cloud provider is going to be based on what the organizational needs are. So I hope that answered at least some of your question, Kate.
Yes, definitely. Yes, definitely.
But I'd love to hear Marius and Richard's thoughts on.
Yes, sure.
On that.
I could maybe chime in with something. Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of the point about lock in sort of has come up a couple of times. obviously there's there is that sort of potentiality if you sort of, as I think Adam said, put all your rather Marius put all your eggs in one basket, and I do appreciate that. However, there is obviously ways that you can get around that, and you don't have to kind of get locked in. And that would be by using, not necessarily using the public cloud providers sort of tools and platforms for something in there as a service, but actually, building your own and creating your own using, open source and some of the other sort of enterprise-based, tools. Everything from really sort of building the cloud infrastructure to how you create your environment, in other words, in the cloud infrastructure, all the way to actually running your services. So I think in that sort of sense, it's very much the right workload for the right public cloud, and multi-clouds, as I said earlier, seems to be a kind of pretty much a default for most sort of enterprises. There's especially the larger ones where they can kind of invest in multiple sort of technologies and so on. The other approach is to obviously innovate your services. So by service, I mean applications. And the way that you do that is by creating code that runs independently from the cloud. So you can run it, as serverless, for example, and that would not necessarily mean that there is no server running. There's always a server at the end of the stack somewhere, but it does mean that the code is independent in terms of how it operates, not dependent on a particular environment, for example, and that can be that can kind of free you up from that. The question on data, and we kind of came back to that via the security sort of door again. I think for data sort of security, there's two kind of things really. There's the we talked about the sort of the public cloud provider already doing security and kind of doing very high security, and Adam mentioned HIPAA and so on. It's kind of compliant with all that stuff. So that's kind of the public cloud providers' responsibility done. But this move to the cloud is a shared responsibility model. I'm sure if you Google that, you'll see that sort of diagram that goes from one end to the other. And as you kind of go more towards software, the enterprise's sort of responsibility becomes less. So you kind of putting stuff in, in Workday, for example, or Salesforce, well, they should really take care of everything for you, including securing your data, because you're not there to make the decision about how you encrypt your data and so on. It's just kind of an access and a sort of a utilization consumption sort of model for SaaS, for example, software as a service. But kind of infrastructure service, platform as a service, and so on, all the other kind of stuff in between, it's a shared responsibility model. So the enterprises can't get away with not doing any security or saying, well, it's all in the cloud, it's all HIPAA compliant, and we don't have to worry about it. No, for data specifically, you have to have a strategy, and that is part of what the Class Center of Excellence would drive and make decisions on in consultation with a partner. So a consultancy would be able to help with that. And there's, again, number of options there. And that kind of all, I guess, focuses around, what some sort of, it's almost an industry standard term around sort of cloud data management. And that, is about kind of how you back up and recover your data, how you secure your data, how you encrypt your data, how you sort of apply access to that data, how you replicate the data from one region to another, perhaps, that you want, and so on. So cloud data management is kind of the space or the technology that kind of looks at that, both from your infrastructure, so all of your Kubernetes clusters and the containers that are running your applications and so on, but also from the data that those services are actually accessing as well.
Thank you, Richard. Marius?
Yeah, speaking about parameters where the cloud is prohibited, you people already spoke about many of the things which are important in that extent. I would add one one additional one on the table, which may be the competition on the same market for some companies. The example being not necessarily focused on that, but Amazon competing on both retail and cloud services fields. And so more or less obviously some retail company will avoid AWS for that reason, not necessarily all, but this is an interesting case. Coming back to the sensitive data, because this is the elephant in the room, right? So this is definitely a thing that is, the key decision point, whether you prohibit or not your application in the cloud at the initial, evaluation. And then there are some, or maybe eventually many things that may change on the road. In regards to the technology made available, in regards to the approaches and the business cases, I would put two examples here. The first is what Richard mentioned is the appearance of the sovereign clouds or sovereign instances of the clouds, depending on the situation, which are once again regions or cloud providers which are based in a particular geographical or geopolitical area and which respect all the constraints coming from that geopolitical area, data residing exclusively in the area, not responding to the Cloud Act constraints and other things like that. But that means that this kind of provider, which respects this kind of things and is, marketed as a sovereign or trusted cloud, could host this kind of sensitive data that initially you prohibited for the cloud, right? So in that case, you may change your decision and go that way. Another thing is the technology evolution, and I would give the example of the confidential computing, which is a particular technology which lets you execute workloads in a enclave of memory which is encrypted at runtime, and which completes the whole chain of data moving and being at rest and then being executed and so on. So you have at the end of the day, maybe all the bricks that you need to secure even sensitive data in the cloud. So that may be also a decision that help changing the situation for the sensitive data. This is what I want to add on the discussion in addition to what the colleagues have said already.
Thank you very much. And actually, I have one more question to addition to these several questions. Do you personally see any changes during this year, like regards all these unfortunate events during war or crisis, like beginning of economical crisis? Maybe you see some changes in the environment and how companies decided to do that way or other way. So maybe you can add something in that area also, topic.
I mean, in general, I think the cloud will continue to be a cornerstone and will only continue to grow regardless of what's happening in society, unless we have economic collapse, right? I mean, in all honesty, when we begin to think about, when we really begin to think about it, in order for any organization to compete, they need commoditization of infrastructure, for example. So and nominally, the cloud will provide us with automated ways of deploying infrastructure, so we can begin to deploy, so we can drive workloads across it, right? No matter how we slice it. And as organizations grow, or even as more and more organizations continue to come into being, meaning they're created, that need will still be there, no matter what happens, right? Like I said, unless there's an economic crisis that is global. But I do see that need for cloud not slowing down over the next several years. In fact, I see it continuously increasing as more and more companies come into being, and we continue to drive capitalization at a global level. As long as those factors are there, we'll continue to need the cloud, and we'll continue to need the cloud nominally from an infrastructure perspective, because it's just a commoditization. Even if you take a small local dry cleaner, right? While they may not need a cloud infrastructure, they'll at least need a level of functional business systems to track payroll, just as a simple example, right?
Yeah.
And those offerings being in the cloud exist. And so the reality is why would I make an investment on-prem for that need when I can go to an off-prem solution, even for a small business? That it doesn't even have to be a technology business. It could be a simple convenience store with multiple employees, right? But as our economic our economy continues to grow globally, which it is, and our capitalism continues to grow globally, that off-prem cloud environment will continue to be there.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Maybe some other thoughts
about that.
Yeah, I can maybe just come in very quickly. I think you kind of mentioned hostile and sort of areas of conflict that might sort of make us think twice about putting stuff in the cloud. I think up to a certain degree, obviously, that's down to the cloud provider and their sort of service and your sort of level of agreement that you have with them. But also, just putting stuff in the cloud doesn't mean you can't have a backup and recovery strategy and a DR strategy, a disaster recovery strategy. Those still need to be implemented. Cloud data management helps with that, as I mentioned earlier, but you still need to implement that and obviously test that. Should you need to pull your data out of a particular area or a particular platform, or geographically something's happening in a particular area that's kind of causing adverse effects to your business. So even though you're in the cloud, you still need to have a strategy for backup and recovery, and also still need to have a strategy for disaster recovery, whatever that might be. I mean, it might be just going back to pen and paper. If that's kind of your DR strategy, fair enough. That's kind of where you are in your business, and actually reverting back to pen and paper for something, that's kind of how it's going to work for you, and that's fine. And I've actually read news stories recently where the cloud availability wasn't there or something, or the system, somebody's data center was hacked or something like that, and were held to ransom. So they actually reverted to pen and paper to, pay their staff, for example. So you need to have something in place, is what I would say. And that's regardless of whether you're in the data center, definitely in the data center, and definitely in the cloud. And again, Cloud Center of Excellence really kind of drives that strategy, also be driving that strategy and making the decisions for that.
Thank you very much. Marius, any thoughts also? Maybe?
Yes. Well, Richard, you picked up my topics because it's exactly what I wanted to talk about the situation that actually I found in my other hat, speaking with my MVP colleagues about cases of Ukrainian companies who left their data center completely being destroyed, and they moved very quickly to the public cloud in that situation. And so the public cloud was the opportunity for that, and it's one of the consequences of the war, of course, and for all the others to think on. We should really have multiple premises for important applications and have in mind disaster recovery plans and fast switch of premises if needed for these critical applications in particular. And yes, we are closer, I would say, to that situation when, yes, you have a disaster recovery plan only in case of, we're closer to that case of right now because of the war. Another thing which changed not only with the war, but with the whole last years, I would say, but the war accelerated that, are the security concerns. Because we are, all of us, subject to multiple attacks, and we know that many of them come from the opposite part of the road, I would say. No matter it's Russia, Iran, or China, or other countries, or not necessarily governmental uh, organizations, but individual groups, which are, very, very active nowadays. And so we really need to be to leverage, of course, more and more bricks from the cloud service providers, more and more integrated ways, more intelligent ways to detect the threats, and apply that in our production environments. And so these are the key things I would wanted to add. One more is that this kind of brutal changes may give us, also in conjunction with the COVID crisis, I would say, that we are often dependent of external factors. And once again, let me um, have the same expression of saying we are, quote, on the good part of the road, having the cloud service providers, which are American, most of the hyperscalers are American. And so we are in the good data centers right now, I would say, in that extent, in the public cloud. Let's have in mind still that, speaking of situation of, Taiwan, we are so much dependent on semiconductors still today, and that will lead further to, dependencies in availability of services within cloud data centers, and with the prices that may change also. So we have to have in mind all these factors which may, impact in unattended ways our day-to-day business, I would say.
Yeah, there's two things you said there, Marius, that I thought were incredibly interesting, especially the one where you were talking about we have to come up with better ways to prevent being hacked, right? And that's where I really see ML AI ops come in to make a significant difference in the cloud. And from a cloud provider perspective, those kinds of organizations that are driving ML and AI ops with their offering makes a substantial competitive difference. Um, uh, the other thing that you had mentioned was around um, the sort of the competitive nature of well, I shouldn't say the competitive nature of COVID. And one of the things I find very, very interesting, for better or for worse, is when we just look at where we are from an information sharing perspective and from a data sharing perspective. The technologies that we have in place today, which were primarily driven from a cloud-based perspective, if we didn't have those technologies in place, this global pandemic, would have lasted many, many more years. Even if you rewind 10 years ago, even if you take the pandemic to where we are today and go back 10 years, based on where we are today, we were able to reduce this to a couple of years. If you go back 10 years or even 15 years, the pandemic would have lasted a significantly longer time, just simply based on the amount of data sharing that we're able to do. And a lot of that is facilitated through our cloud environment. So I thought those were very interesting points and just wanted to elaborate on those a little bit.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, it is really interesting when we start talking, not just as like regular pros and cons, but about something which is really happening right now, and like couple last years. Actually, I have a question about, I think it's more to Richard, about preventing some dangerous incidents like security breaches or something else if you go fully cloud. So, for example, this is like small company which is like going cloud, as you said, and how they can prevent like these security problems they can.
Sure. I would say, you need to go back to the shared responsibility model. So the public cloud provider offers you security in terms of where you store stuff and so on, but it doesn't secure the actual data, it doesn't secure the actual workload. So if any of your workloads are public facing, so they need to communicate with the outside world, whether it's a web server or whatever it is, all of that still requires security. Now, the thing to remember, then obviously there are tools both from the public cloud provider and third party sort of standalone tools or open source tools that you can use to help you secure your workloads, as well as the infrastructure that you're building. So Marius mentioned things like a Kubernetes cluster. Again, there is security for that. There's security for the containers or the microservices that might be running in that Kubernetes cluster in terms of how they communicate. So the major things to consider, and I kind of always try to point this out to customers, is when you go from data center to cloud, in regards to kind of what your decisions were and reasons, the two major things that ultimately change are your security and your connectivity or networking. So you're kind of going from a castle and moat sort of approach in the data center, host-based, static IP, Active Directory sort of service accounts, to a zero trust environment in the cloud with service registries, secrets managers, encryption, and ephemeral workloads. So that's kind of all the type of things that organizations need to consider, and that's obviously what we provide advice on for them. So and again, final just point on the security aspect. So shared responsibility model, you got to kind of do your side of it as well as an enterprise. And using those kind of tools, and those tools change from the data center. Don't go and kind of implement your usual data center stuff in the cloud. That's not going to work. The other thing to really remember, and this is, I think, very much misused and sometimes abused, as well as the terms like cybersecurity, for example. Security is multiple layers, and you really got to look at all of those layers in the cloud, and make sure that you have a strategy around how you do that security in the cloud. And again, there'll be tools that might be from the public cloud provider, if that kind of makes sense, and you can make use of that, and that allows you to accelerate your sort of time to market. Great, go and use those for now, and maybe you can kind of get off those in 18 months time or whatever. But there's also obviously commercial tools that you can get from vendors that offer their tools in the public cloud, as well as open source tools. So if you have the skills within your organization to do that, then you can obviously roll your own as well. But security in the cloud is multiple layers, and I would say you need to kind of look at all of those when you're doing anything in terms of your strategy for security in the cloud.
Thank you very much. Actually, we're planning like different discussion about security in clouds, like with like a bunch of our speakers. So I think we'll like dive deep into this topic like a bit later, I think in a month or two. So we have a question from our audience. They ask us to touch commercial aspect of cloud versus on-premises. As mentioned, it is shift from CapEx to OpEx, but also difficult to predict OpEx. Operational expenses is really difficult to predict, I think.
Yeah, I can probably maybe just come in very quickly on that again. I mean, yeah, it's obviously, it is a shift, as I said earlier in our talk. I think my sort of response to the prediction of that is that you can predict it better in the cloud than you can necessarily in the data center. And if you're really have your sort of cloud implementation and strategy, well thought out and well designed, then you should be able to cater for and anticipate any issues that may occur, both from DR and sort of recovery sort of process that we discussed earlier, but also from a scaling out. So you're kind of a retailer and you're sort of being hit over Christmas time because there's more demands on your website and so on. Then you should be able to scale that environment out very quickly. And you could even, to a degree, if you trust the environment enough and you kind of have the knowledge enough to actually automate that process. So again, observability tools such as the kind of the Acure and various other ones can actually give you the metrics that you need to see that there is a greater demand. Maybe it's kind of around Christmas time and lots of people are hitting your website to buy various whatever goods and things like that, presents and so on. So you get that sort of alert, that event information from an observability platform, and that could automate the request or the directive to your Kubernetes environment, and your Kubernetes environment will scale out automatically. So you can take it to that degree. You could also include some manual human sort of gates, if you like, along that process to make the decisions manually if you want to do that. But scaling out is the way to actually deal with that sort of the sort of anticipation, or those kind of areas where you're not kind of expecting a requirement, a higher requirement for for your service. So as long as you have that designed and that's part of your architecture, then cloud, I would say, is kind of can cope with that infinitely better.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add on to that. Fun and the question. I mean, and the question is 100% correct. I mean, the reality is, though, when you think about capex versus opex, it all comes back to the mindset that your business is in and how they're willing to spend money. Most financial controllers don't want to potentially spend money for something that they might have a problem with, right? You might need to scale, or you might have a need for infrastructure. They like it definitively, and that's where the capex piece comes into play. And that's where you start getting into yearly budgets, which, in all honesty, who can actually predict in a year what they're going to need financially, right? And that's to be frank, a very, very old, well, it's still in play today, but it's a very, very old mindset, right? In reality, trying to drive that OpEx budget based on, like Richard said, observability really will help put a fine point on when you might need that money and why you might need that money, and will allow your financial controllers to have a much better understanding of where they're going to spend that money based on some level of historical data and information, which will begin to pull them away from that CapEx model and much more into that OpEx model.
Thank you, Marius.
Yes, that's interesting because this, in theory, takes you back to the advantage of being on premises. On premises, uh, all the costs are clear. You know how much you invest at the beginning. You know how much it will cost. Whether when you go to the cloud, I have a serverless service. How many calls I'll have, what traffic I'll have on the on the network to see the peering consumption and what's the cadence of logs that will be ingested and how much and so on. So these are the things that are so complicated in the cloud, and everyone's complaining that they are not capable actually to anticipate all that. What's behind that is that actually there are two things actually coming together, hopefully at some point in time. First of all, the way of calculating the cost on premises hides actually. You know, a very the very rough estimation that um, the application owners are capable to do in order for the applications to run. And so in that extent they will simply make the you know the safest calculation to say, yeah, I need this kind of number of servers and so on and so on. At the end of the line, it hides a lot of cost that could have been optimized. So the big difference is, yes, I know how much it cost me, but it will be more that it should cost me actually, typically. On the other side, on the cloud, uh, there are many, yeah, the cloud is so nice. And once again, as a Azure MVP, I know the greatness of the public cloud. Uh, but when you have the surprise at the end of the month to have, I don't know how many thousands of euros of consumption simply on a, on a logs workspace, you're saying it must be nuts, can be true. So the thing is that some service providers, cloud service providers, do start adapting their model of consumption to be a bit closer to a predictable one. I mean, they go, for example, for database consumption, uh, go back to a core-based model consumption, which is more predictable, more simple to, calculate at the end. That's not feasible for all the situations because you'll have still serverless services and consumption of resources like egress bandwidth and things like that. But we're going to a hopefully more predictable model with a better calculators, um, which eventually will help you predict better uh, your consumption in the public cloud. The last point is, in any case, it's your application. If you are really the master of your application, if you know it so well, you should be able to calculate estimatedly how many calls from how many customers you'll have, how many calls you'll have per month, and what the bandwidth that you'll consume and everything. So this is finally the key point.
Yeah, I would say just add one extra point on that is for kind of that sort of level of predictability in terms of your costs and consumption, and also to look at it from a cost reduction point of view, which incidentally also leads you directly into a kind of a greener implementation of your services in the cloud, because it's having less services and running consuming less of the cloud means that you're actually more green as well. So it's a kind of a direct of that is looking at certainly a kind of infrastructure as code and serverless and things like that, which help you kind of with those sorts of predictions, because you can obviously provision those services and as and when you need them, and you can scale existing services as and when you need them, as we kind of gave the sort of the Christmas example and when there's kind of more demand. But the way to really get the finance sort of governed properly is to implement FinOps as part of your strategy. So again, we go back to Cloud Center of Excellence and having them to actually look at FinOps, getting your finance team, your CFO involved in that process to look at actually how you can control your costs and also put gates and gateways and things like that that help you to mitigate any sort of issues that you have in terms of overspending and things like that. And that can be both for sort of the human factor, where developers are just kind of dropping stuff into a public cloud and kind of using more resources, but also as well as the automated platforms where they're kind of looking to scale out. And again, there's FinOps policies that you can apply as part of that process. So FinOps is the kind of the approach to do that.
If I could add one point on that, I totally agree with you with your FinOps methodology and practicing. one of the key points that can be done actually is to have in place, and some of the organizations put that in place, technical or also not only technical mechanisms within the cloud, which I would say include policies to control either security criteria or compliance criteria or FinOps criteria or resilience criteria. So this kind of engine of control of the global compliance of the cloud usage is very useful. It's not necessarily cheap to implement, but it will be very helpful on the long run with different teams that will be much easier onboarded and will be automatically, I would say, accompanied to go on the straight road to the cloud.
Thanks a lot for all your thoughts. And we have, I think, like only a couple questions to add. And first would be about how would you run the on-prem versus cloud assessment? We talked a bit about it, but maybe we can summarize somehow for enterprise application implementation. So maybe just briefly, we can summarize what we said about it.
I can certainly offer something around that. I mean, I think there's obviously a certain approach that you would take in terms of doing a sort of an assessment. Again, I think this is very much the responsibility of the likes of your competency center or your class center of excellence to kind of make those decisions. But the overall decision, is not really that. The overall decision is, whether you kind of want to go to cloud. And if you are going to go to cloud, then you'd probably look at existing applications that you have in the data center and look at, as well as the data that's attached to those, to actually migrate those into the cloud. That assessment is a standard thing that's done. You can certainly go to the public cloud providers, but also the likes of T-Systems. We run those types of assessments to help customers first of all appreciate what they have in the data center, look at all the workloads, and we go to very, very fine, minute detail on each of those applications, and we do that with our customers, and then we make decisions on which applications are the appropriate candidates to start with, and then we go through the process of what each of those applications requires to be migrated to the cloud. Is there codes changes? Is there configuration changes? Is it reliant on certain peripheral files and runtimes and things like that? So all of that's really taken into account. And really where you go into the cloud, so I said there's multiple stages that you can go into the cloud. This is very much dependent, again, on what strategy you've decided initially, and maybe you've having or you've decided like a two-step strategy where you kind of just go into infrastructure as code to begin with, and then think about containerization and serverless and and DevOps and things like that. And that might come as a stage 2 or a stage 3 and a sort of migration for you. So some customers go straight into, as I said, sort of stage 3, stage 4 sort of approach, where they kind of start changing the way that they develop applications. They go from waterfall method to an agile method and use DevOps sort of methodologies, and and also stage 4 kind of do more serverless infrastructure as code and things like that, and microservices. But others actually are kind of a little bit more cautious in terms of their approach, maybe because they need their IT team to kind of skill up as well. This is a cultural change as well as a technology change for any enterprise. It's not just changing one type of technology for another. It's also a cultural shift as well. So assessments are certainly done when you migrate. Assessments in terms of whether this should end up in the data center or the cloud will depend on your policy and what your CCO has agreed.
Thank you. Maybe some other thoughts?
I was just going to add to that driven by the business. I mean, that would be the only big thing I'd add there. And when you peel back and you look at, from a business value perspective, what are you really trying to drive? That will definitely begin to break down into what Richard was talking about. And it's interesting because organizations make conscious efforts to use on-prem versus off-prem and build out their own cloud environment. And I guess the question becomes, why? What's the business value that's driving that? And it might be, like we talked about earlier, well, I've got all of this investment in capital. Why am I going to waste this? And I'll build out my own cloud center of excellence and do that on-prem and focus that there versus driving it on-prem. But I totally agree with Richard's general assessment from a tactical perspective, for sure.
Yes, thank you. Marius, maybe also.
Yes, in regards to the assessment approach, definitely this would be, we mentioned a lot of criteria that should be put in this assessment in regards to all the aspects we discussed in the call. At the end, we should have a decision tree which will tell the application to rehost, to replatform, to refactor, maybe to remove if we're moving to another solution. And by these choices, we will have also a clear direction whether to go to the public cloud, to the private cloud, to a traditional infrastructure. And yeah, I believe all this is at some point well structured with, as Richard said, the Cloud Center of Excellence guidance. And from that moment, you go with this structured approach to mass migration. But you'd have to go through this, a very structured discussion with the assessment and have all the good criteria, which some of them are, very generic, found in every, typical assessment, but you may have some specific criteria to your organization. And you need to see that in your context in regards to the business model, as Adam said, and build your own particular decision tree as for your organization. It can fit maybe depending on the situation. If it's for very simple organizations or very, recent ones, you may simply take an assessment sheet from Microsoft or Amazon and go ahead with. Okay, but essentially, if you have a more complex organization with much more criteria and the situations, you have to adjust your assessment, and at the end, you have this decision tree which guide you.
Thank you very much. Actually, I think that right now it's really clear how to implement the assessment and go to the cloud or on-prem, because we really cover so much criteria on that topic. So it is, I hope that it's clear for our attendee who asked that question also. And I have two last questions. I would like to briefly wrap up our conversation, but I can't I can't ask it. How do you monitor your environment or your infrastructure? Because you have different approaches, as we see, and which solutions do you apply to monitor your infrastructure? Can you please share maybe some names, maybe not, maybe some approaches you would like to share also with us in that case? Because me actually interested personally, how do you do on-prem monitoring or hybrid cloud monitoring? So I'm just really curious.
Well, there's lots of different, if we're speaking more about tooling, right? There's lots of different tools out there that can,
Yep.
some are commercially available right off the shelf. We use combinations of tools, and through our SRE team, who primarily does all of our or any of our monitoring for any of our cloud-based applications that we run. We use various things like Prometheus, Nagios, and other observability tools to begin to help us obtain the information we need in order to react and respond to various notification systems. But you know, it all depends on how much money you're willing to spend, and you know, and what you're trying to accomplish from a notification, or an observability and reliability system. We had some very call them customized use cases, which is why we went down the path we went down. But if you don't have necessarily customized use cases, you could use something available, open source, commercially available off the shelf.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe some others.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's a fundamental difference. I pointed out to kind of security and connectivity being sort of different from what you had in the data center versus in the public cloud. It's a similar story, I think, for you know, general sort of monitoring, as it's called. I think that's kind of the general umbrella term, and then within that is things like observability platforms. Adam mentioned a few of those sort of open source ones, like the Prometheus, Grafana, etc., which kind of you can build your sort of environment based around those. If you have that sort of skill set and you have the sort of the teams, or you can obviously go for the public cloud providers sort of tools. They provide a plethora of tools that help with the entire sort of cloud environment. They even actually stretch beyond their own. And we were talking about multi-cloud. Now they can actually support multiple sort of cloud platforms as well. The vendors are kind of coming in as part of that as well. So going back to what Marius said about sort of Kubernetes and so on, there is that sort of layer where, again, you can monitor all of your sort of Kubernetes, clusters, but also go multi-cloud if you have that, and multi-version as well. So kind of, Kubernetes from vendor A and Kubernetes from vendor B, both of those can be managed by, the Kubernetes sort of management platform from vendor A, for example. So again, I've seen that quite a lot in the last 18 months, and I think that's only goodness in this sort of whole space. The differences are that you're going from a systems management sort of environment to an observability environment. Observability, so systems management is kind of really focused on looking at the applications from the outside in. So you have like agents and things like that monitor applications and services and processes and so on. Whereas really observability is looking at it from the inside out. So from the inside, the cloud native application, if that's what that's what you've developed and that's what you've deployed in the cloud, will include a number of parameters that basically help you to monitor that application, as well as do other things as well in that sort of monitoring sort of space. So your observability platform is looking at metrics, logs, and traces. Those are the kind of the three sort of parameters. I call that MELT for short. So uppercase M, lowercase E, and then uppercase L and uppercase T, because I can never, apart from that, I can never remember them. So MELT for short works for me, and otherwise I get confused. Yes, that was just something I came up with, and I thought, wow, that actually works. That's great. I can now remember metrics, logs, and traces. Otherwise, I can't do it. Anyway, so observability, platforms look at that. The great thing with those, and I have pressed a number of sort of observability vendors on this, is what is the AI and ML aspect of your platform actually doing? What is it that you're actually providing there? And I think the ideas, this was when I kind of worked at IBM, we had a number of sort of systems management tools, and we kind of did start the ideas of kind of doing this back then. It wasn't kind of called AI and ML in those days, but this kind of predictability and the ability to point patterns or to identify patterns in failures and problems and things like that. So that's kind of really where, so that sort of observability, we're using things like AI ops, for example, would really kind of, come into it and help the ops teams and the SREs, site reliability engineering teams, to kind of do their job. From the inside, it would be things like chaos engineering, actually building into your code failures, the way to actually break applications. And that's what chaos engineering will do. It will actually deliberately go and break certain parts of your application to see how resilient it is and how your entire service for that application will cope. So that looks at kind of essentially how you've architected that service in the cloud. And obviously, if it fails completely, it didn't do a good job. So we go back to the drawing board and kind of improve on that. But if it did cope with that, that's great. And then we kind of see how we can replicate that success, elsewhere as well, and kind of use that as a blueprint, if you like, for developing applications. So chaos engineering from the inside, AIOps, again, kind of looking again from the inside on metrics, logs, and traces. And yeah, that differs kind of from how we used to do things in the data center using systems management tools, which are kind of looking at applications from the outside in.
Thank you very much. Yes. Marius, maybe also some thoughts.
Yes, I won't enter it now. I won't be so exhaustive. Maybe, especially that I won't be able to, let's say, disclose the exact products that we're using in the company. But as a principle, the approach and the tendency is to use definitely the open source frameworks for logging and diagnostics. And when they are also implemented as managed services by the cloud service providers, it's even better because we have the managed service, and at the same time it's an open platform, so we can be at any moment compatible, and we can extract the data, move elsewhere if needed, and so on. So and this is essentially the approach, the tendency we're seeing of using as much as possible managed services for monitoring, logging, diagnostics in the public cloud, but having this also opportunity to be compatible to external tools. And last particular point in that is that in a multi-cloud environment, the initial concern of be sure not to depend exclusively on one platform becomes very concrete when you're saying that I have a very good tool in one of the public cloud providers which helps you consolidate all the logs and give me maybe a very good CM as a solution, so that I can analyze those logs and do everything. It sounds so wonderful, except when this CM won't be available for some reason and for duration of time. So in that moment, all your three clouds are actually unavailable from this functionality perspective. So we have to be very, very careful on this kind of dependencies and ensure maybe different approaches with not complete dependencies on one particular cloud, and ensure, for example, for the private cloud, maybe its own implementation, even if it costs more than if we would use a single platform centralized.
Thank you very much. Actually, I think that we would wrap up our conversation. This was really beautiful discussion, and actually, I think I wrote down a lot of thoughts, a lot of to think about, like to the future. So thanks a lot, and I hope that our audience also enjoy our conversation. And I need to say that we would send the recordings to every attendee who have been registered. And thanks a lot, our amazing speakers, to each of you, because your experience, your thoughts is really priceless from different set of perspectives. But also I can say that we, I think, agreed on so many topics. So we can see like the blueprints in the industry, actually, at least in enterprise companies, and it is great also because we don't argue too much. So actually it was pretty nice and simple to moderate your session. Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Happy
everyone.
to discuss to every one of you. See you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.